Not a soul helped the dying cowboy, until a saloon maid took a stand. Why did a town full of God-fearing folk let a dying man bleed in the dust? And what made a young saloon maid risk everything to save a cowboy no one else would even look at? My name is Elsie Mae Fletcher, and in 1882, in the heart of Laramie, I witnessed something that changed everything I thought I knew about mercy, justice, and the price of doing what's right. I saw a man stumble into our street, bleeding, whispering a name no one recognized. I watched him fall face first in front of the Red Lantern Saloon doors, and I saw no one move. Except me. This is what really happened that day, and how one dying cowboy changed the fate of an entire town. I was sweeping the front steps of the Red Lantern when I saw him coming down Main Street like death walking upright. His horse was long gone, his hat missing, and dark stains covered his shirt from shoulder to waist. I watched him stumble against a hitching post, catch himself with shaking hands, then push forward like a man possessed. Each step looked like it cost him a year of his life. Tell her. I heard him whisper to no one, his voice carrying on the morning air like a prayer. Tell her. I found it. Then I saw him collapse right there in front of our saloon doors. His body hit the wooden walkway with a sound I'll carry to my grave, the sound of hope dying. Blood began pooling beneath him, bright red against the weathered boards. I stood frozen with that broom in my hands, watching a human being bleed to death while the good people of Laramie went about their morning business like nothing was happening. What I witnessed next still haunts my dreams. I watched our regular customers step over his body like he was nothing more than a broken board or roadkill. One man, Banker Harrison, actually laughed. Looks like the riffraff is cleaning itself up, I heard him tell his companion. Another patron, Old Pete Wilkins, spat tobacco juice that landed inches from the cowboy's face. I felt my hands clench around that broom handle as rage built in my chest like a fever. Across the street, I saw Sheriff Morrison standing in his doorway, arms crossed, deliberately looking the other way. He saw everything. He chose to do nothing. That's when something broke inside me. I dropped my broom and knelt beside the dying man, my knees hitting the blood-soaked boards. My apron immediately stained red, but I didn't care about that anymore. Hey, I whispered, touching his shoulder gently. Hey, you're going to be all right. His eyes opened, pale blue, like winter sky, and I saw more pain in them than any human should have to bear. But I also saw recognition, gratitude, hope. Thank you, he breathed, so quietly I almost missed it. I tried to lift him, but the man was dead weight in my arms. The other saloon girls stood in the doorway, staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Completely. Elsie, what in hell are you doing? I heard Mary Sullivan ask, her Irish accent thick with disbelief. I ignored her and started dragging him toward the door. It was like moving a sack of grain, except this sack was bleeding and barely breathing. Get out of my way, I told the customers who blocked the entrance, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. Buck Morrison, the bartender and the sheriff's cousin, stepped forward with authority written all over his face. Let him die, Elsie. He's trouble. Look at all that blood. Probably killed someone. I looked up at Buck with every ounce of fury I could summon. So have you, Buck. So have half the men in this place. But I don't see anyone dragging you into the street to die like a dog. I heard gasps from the other girls. Nobody talked to Buck Morrison like that. Nobody who wanted to keep working anyway. But I'd made my choice. I was getting this man inside, and Buck Morrison could go straight to hell. Move, I said again, and something in my voice made him step aside. As I struggled to get the cowboy through that door, time seemed to fold back on itself. Suddenly I was 14 again, standing outside the First Baptist Church while my father lay dying in our wagon. I remembered pounding on those heavy wooden doors, begging Reverend Coleman to let us in, to help us. Pa had taken a bad fall from the Hendersons' roof, and I knew he was dying. Please, I had begged that holy man. He needs help. He's hurt real bad. But I remembered the Reverend looking at my father's work clothes, at the dirt under his fingernails, at the bottle of whiskey in the wagon, medicine for the pain, nothing more. "This is God's house," the Reverend had said, his voice cold as winter stone. "Not a hospital for drunks and degenerates." I had watched my father die in that wagon while the good Christian folk of Laramie sang hymns about love and mercy. They didn't understand. I listened to him take his last breath while they praised a God they claimed loved everyone. I swore that day I'd never let it happen again. Not if I could help it. Not while there was breath in my body. I dragged the cowboy to my small room behind the saloon, the place where I kept my few possessions and tried to find peace in a world that offered precious little of it. My hands shook as I tore strips from my best petticoat, the white one with lace trim that had belonged to my mother. The only beautiful thing I owned, and I was about to ruin it with a stranger's blood. I could see the wound was bad. A bullet hole in his left side, maybe from a rifle. It had gone clean through, which was good, but he'd lost so much blood that his skin looked like old parchment. I pressed the cloth against the wound and felt his blood seep through immediately, warm and sticky between my fingers. He moaned, but didn't wake up. "Stay with me," I whispered, though I couldn't say why. I didn't even know his name. Mrs. Henderson had taught me some doctoring before she died, how to clean wounds, how to stitch skin, how to tell if someone was beyond saving. This man wasn't beyond saving. Not yet. I threaded a needle with the steadiest hands I could manage and began stitching torn flesh back together. Each stitch made him flinch even in unconsciousness. Each drop of his blood stained my apron darker. But I kept going because someone had to. Someone had to care. As I worked by candlelight, binding his wounds and trying to stop the bleeding, I heard him whisper something that froze my blood in my veins. "June," he mumbled, his head turning restlessly on the makeshift pillow I'd fashioned from my shawl. "Is June safe? Did they find her?" I stopped stitching. My hands went completely still. June. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 9 long years. Not since she was taken from me. Not since the day my world ended and I learned what real helplessness felt like. "What did you say?" I whispered, leaning closer to his fever-flushed face. But he had slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving me with nothing but that name echoing in my head like a gunshot in an empty church. June. My sister June, who would be 22 now if she was still alive. June, who had been torn from my arms by men in gray coats when she was just 13 and I was barely 14. I looked at the cowboy's clothes, mud-stained and torn but still recognizable. Underneath the dirt and blood, I could see the fabric clearly. Gray wool. The same gray as the coat I saw in my nightmares every single night. Would you have helped him? Comment, I would have if this scene moved you. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. I sat back on my heels, staring at this stranger who had spoken my sister's name like it was sacred. My mind raced back to that horrible day 9 years ago when my world came apart. I remembered June and me walking home from Morrison's General Store, carrying flour and sugar for Mrs. Henderson. We were laughing about something, probably making fun of the way Reverend Coleman's wife put on airs when the riders came. 3 men on horseback, moving fast down Main Street like they owned it. The man in the gray coat was leading them, and when he saw June, he reined in his horse so hard it reared up on its hind legs. "That's her," I remembered him saying to his companions, his voice cold as winter wind. "That's the Fletcher girl Morrison described." I had grabbed June's hand and tried to run, but we were just children. They caught us before we made it 10 steps down the street. "Please," I had begged as the man in gray lifted June onto his saddle like she was a sack of grain. "Please don't take her. I'll do anything. Take me instead." But he just looked at me with eyes like chips of flint and said, "We don't need you, girl. We need her." I watched them ride away with my sister screaming my name, and I never saw her again. Sheriff Morrison said there was nothing he could do. Said men like that were too dangerous to chase into the Badlands. But I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. And now this dying cowboy was whispering her name like a prayer. I was still staring at the unconscious man when I heard heavy boots on the back porch. Boots that could only belong to one person in this town. Elsie Fletcher. Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed through the thin walls like thunder. I know you got him in there. Send him out. I could hear at least 2 other sets of boots with him. His deputies, most likely. Or maybe just men looking for the bounty money. That surely rode on this cowboy's head. He's wanted for murder, Morrison continued, his voice getting closer to my door. Killed his own brother over in Cheyenne. There's a $100 reward for him, dead or alive. I looked down at the man I'd been tending. Murder. His own brother. But the way he'd whispered June's name, there was love in it, not violence. Desperation, not cruelty. I ain't got nobody in here, Sheriff. I called back, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when my heart was hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. Don't lie to me, girl. Half the town saw you drag him in there. I heard them moving around outside, probably surrounding my little room. But there was only one way in, and I was sitting right in front of it with a wounded man and a loaded conscience. Then half the town saw wrong. I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. I heard Sheriff Morrison's boots stop right outside my door. I could see his shadow blocking the light that came through the gap at the bottom. Elsie, you're harboring a fugitive. That's a hanging offense in this territory. I stood up slowly, my blood-stained hands clenched into fists at my sides. The rage that had been building in me for 9 years finally found its voice. You hung Jake Santos last year without a trial, Sheriff. Remember him? Remember how you said he was guilty just because he looked guilty to you? I heard uncomfortable silence from the other side of the door. Jake Santos had been a good man, a family man, who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Found out later he was innocent, didn't you? I continued, letting years of suppressed anger fuel my words. But he was already 6 feet under by then, too late to say sorry to his widow and children. That's different, Morrison said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. Is it? Or are you just looking for another innocent man to murder so you can collect that reward money and buy yourself a new suit? I heard one of his companions, Deputy Walsh, I thought, whisper something I couldn't make out, probably asking if this was worth the trouble. I'm not handing him over, I said clearly, so there could be no misunderstanding. Not until I know what really happened. Not until someone besides you decides whether he's guilty or innocent. You're making a big mistake, girl. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. And I'd rather make a mistake trying to save a life than make one trying to take it. I heard them walk away, but I knew they'd be back. Morrison wasn't the type to give up when there was money involved, especially not when his authority was being challenged by a saloon girl. The cowboy's eyes opened about an hour after Morrison left. I was sitting beside him, cleaning blood off my hands with a wet rag, when I saw those pale blue eyes focus on my face with startling clarity. Where? He started to say, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. You're safe? I told him, though I wasn't sure that was true anymore. For now, anyway. He tried to sit up, but I put my hand on his chest to keep him down. His skin was fever hot and slick with sweat. Don't move. You'll tear the stitches I just put in. I watched him look around my small room, at my few possessions, at the blood-stained petticoat strips, at my face with its expression of grim determination. You helped me, he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. Nobody else would. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with those winter sky eyes. Then he said words that changed everything I thought I knew about justice and truth. They killed my brother Jacob, shot him in the back and left him to die like a dog. But everyone thinks it was me who did it. His voice was rough with pain and exhaustion. I found proof, though. I found out who really killed him and why. I leaned forward, my heart starting to race. What kind of proof? Papers, letters, evidence that shows certain people have been taking money to look the other way while innocent folks get murdered. He reached into his shirt pocket with shaking fingers and pulled out a folded envelope. This is why they want me dead. Not because I killed anyone, but because I can prove who did. I stared at that envelope like it might bite me. What's your name? I asked. Thomas, he said. Thomas Gray. And I came to Laramie looking for someone. A girl who was taken from this town 9 years ago. A girl named June Fletcher. The room went completely silent except for my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like a locomotive. Who do you think June is? A sister? A lover? Drop your theory in the comments. I felt the world tilt sideways under me. June Fletcher. My sister. This man had come looking for my sister. How do you know that name? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Thomas Gray looked at me with new intensity, like he was seeing me for the first time. What's your last name? Fletcher. I watched. His eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been hope. Elsie Fletcher. June used to talk about her sister Elsie all the time. Said she had brown hair and brown eyes and the stubbornest chin in all of Wyoming territory. I touched my chin unconsciously. June had always teased me about sticking it out when I was being defiant. You knew my sister? I asked, barely able to get the words past the lump in my throat. I married her, he said simply, and my world exploded. The room spun around me. I had to grab the edge of the crate I was sitting on to keep from falling over. Married, I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. 3 years ago, in a little church outside of Cheyenne. She wore a blue dress. She made herself and wildflowers in her hair. His voice grew softer as he remembered. She talked about you every single day. Said her sister Elsie was the bravest person she ever knew. Said you tried to save her when those men took her. I felt tears running down my cheeks, but I didn't care. Is she alive? Is she safe? Thomas's expression grew dark as storm. Clouds. She was. Until my brother Jacob found out I'd married her. Until he decided to use her to get back at me for something that happened years ago. What do you mean? My brother Jacob was one of the men who took her from you, Elsie. He was working for corrupt lawmen who were taking young girls and selling them to men who paid good money for slaves nobody would miss. I felt sick. All these years, I'd wondered, what happened to June? I'd imagined she was dead because the alternative was too horrible to think about. But she escaped. Thomas continued quickly, seeing my distress. Got away when she was 17 and made her way to Cheyenne. That's where I met her. She was working in a boarding house, trying to make an honest living. And you fell in love. She was the strongest person I ever met. Had been through hell itself, but she hadn't let it break her spirit. She still believed in good people, still believed the world could be better than it was. I wiped tears from my eyes with the back of my hand. Where is she now? Thomas's face went pale as his wound. That's what I'm trying to find out. Jacob found out about our marriage. Thomas continued, his voice getting weaker with exhaustion and loss of blood. He came to our house 3 weeks ago with 2 other men. Said I'd stolen something that belonged to him. June wasn't his property, I said fiercely. Try telling him that. He took her, Elsie, dragged her out of our house while I was in town, buying supplies for the winter. When I got back, the place was torn apart and there was a note. What did it say? That if I ever wanted to see her alive again, I'd better keep my mouth shut about what I knew about their operation. About the girls they'd taken over the years. About the murders they'd committed to cover their tracks. I looked at the envelope he'd shown me earlier. That's what's in there. Names, dates, amounts of money paid. A whole network of corrupt lawmen and politicians getting rich off human misery. His eyes burned with fever and determination. Enough. Evidence to hang them all. So Jacob took June to keep you quiet. And then he got greedy. Decided that even with June as leverage, I knew too much to let live. So he came after me with his gun. Thomas touched his wounded side gingerly. shot me, and left me for dead. But he made one mistake. What mistake? He told everyone I shot him. Made up some story about a fight over our father's inheritance. Got the local sheriff to put a murder warrant out on me, painting me as the killer. I understood now. But you're not dead, and you still have the evidence. That's right. And now they're all scrambling to find me before I can get this information to someone who'll actually do something about it instead of taking bribes to look the other way. I heard footsteps outside again, heavier this time. More than before. It sounded like half the town was gathering in the alley behind the saloon. Elsie, Sheriff Morrison called, his voice harder than before. We know you got Thomas Gray in. There. Send him out now, or we're coming in to get him ourselves. Thomas tried to get up, but I pushed him back down with both hands. You're not going anywhere, I told him firmly. You're still bleeding, and you can barely sit up straight. They'll kill you if you don't hand me over. I looked at this man who had married my sister, who had tried to save her, who was the only link I had to June after all these years of not knowing. Then I guess they'll have to kill me, I said, because I'm not giving up the only person who can tell me what happened to my sister. I could hear them moving around outside, surrounding my little room like wolves circling wounded. Pray. I counted at least 6 different voices, maybe more. You got 5 minutes, Elsie. Morrison shouted through the thin walls. Then we're coming in whether you like it or not. I looked around desperately, trying to think of a way out. There was only one door and one small window, both of which they probably had covered. The walls were thin wood that wouldn't stop a bullet. The floor was just boards over dirt. There's got to be another way, I muttered to myself. Thomas watched me pace back and forth in the tiny space. There's a root cellar under the main saloon, he said weakly. I saw the entrance when you were dragging me inside. Does it connect to this building? I thought about it. The red lantern had been built in sections over the years, with additions and modifications as business grew or shrank. There might be the coal chute, I said suddenly, remembering. There's an old coal chute that connects to the cellar under the main building. That's how they used to get coal to the furnace before they switched to wood. Can you get me there? I looked at his wound, at the fresh blood seeping through the bandages I'd just applied. You can barely walk from here to the door. I don't have to walk far, just far enough to disappear. I heard Morrison's voice again, closer and angrier than before. 3 minutes, Elsie. I made my decision. I helped Thomas to his feet, supporting most of his weight as we moved toward the back corner of the room. There, hidden behind a pile of old crates and boxes, was a small door I'd nearly forgotten about. I pulled the obstacles aside and opened the door. Beyond it was darkness and the smell of cold dust and damp earth. This goes under the saloon, I explained quickly. There's a ladder that leads down to the cellar, and from there you can get to the main coal storage. There's an outside entrance on the far side of the building that they might not have found yet. Thomas nodded, breathing hard from the effort of standing. What about you? I'll stay here. Make them think you're still in the room as long as possible. Elsie, they'll know you helped me escape. They'll arrest you, or worse. Time's up. Morrison bellowed from outside. I heard boots hitting the back porch, the sound of men getting ready to break down my door. Go, I whispered urgently, pushing Thomas toward the coal chute. Find June. Save her. That's all that matters now. I watched him disappear into the darkness just as I heard the first crash of someone throwing their weight against my door. I slammed the coal chute door shut and piled the crates back in front of it just as my door burst open. Sheriff Morrison came through first, gun drawn and ready for trouble, followed by Deputy Walsh and 4 other men I recognized from around town. They looked around the small room, taking in the blood-stained rags, the makeshift bed, all the evidence that someone had been here recently. Where is he? Morrison demanded, his eyes scanning every corner. I crossed my arms and tried to look defiant rather than terrified. Where's who? Don't play games with me, girl. Thomas Gray. The murderer you've been hiding in here. I haven't been hiding anybody from anyone. Morrison grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. There's blood everywhere. Fresh blood. And that window's been opened recently. I looked at the window, which I had indeed opened earlier to get some fresh air while I worked on Thomas's wounds. If they wanted to think he'd escaped that way, I wasn't going to correct them. Maybe he got away while you were standing around. Outside making speeches, I suggested. Morrison's face turned red with anger and frustration. Search the place, he ordered his men. Look under everything. Check every inch of this room. I watched them tear my small space apart, throwing my few possessions around like they were looking for buried treasure. They found the bloody petticoat strips, the needle and thread I'd used for stitching, even the wet rag I'd used to clean my hands. But they didn't find Thomas Gray, and they didn't find the coal chute hidden behind those crates. He was here, Deputy Walsh said, holding up one of the bandages. This blood's still wet. Then where the hell is he? Morrison snarled, his authority crumbling with each passing second. I shrugged like it didn't matter to me. Maybe he's tougher than you thought. Maybe he doesn't stay caught as easy as you figured. Morrison backhanded me across the face, hard enough to make my ears ring and fill my mouth with the taste of blood. But I didn't cry out, didn't give him the satisfaction. You're going to tell me where he went, he said, his voice deadly quiet. One way or another. I wiped blood from my split lip and looked Morrison straight in the eye without flinching. I don't know where he went, and I wouldn't tell you if I did. It wasn't exactly a lie. I knew how Thomas had escaped, but I didn't know where he was going or what his plans were beyond finding June. Bull, Morrison said. You two were in here talking for over an hour. Don't tell me he didn't say where he was headed next. We talked about a lot of things. His wound, whether he was going to live or die, the weather, whether God really loves sinners like the preacher claims. Morrison grabbed me by the hair and yanked my head back, making pain shoot down my neck. Listen to me, you little whore. Thomas Gray is a dangerous man. He killed his own brother in cold blood, and he'll kill you too if you keep helping him. Funny thing about that, I managed to say despite the pain in my scalp. He didn't seem much like a killer to me. Seemed more like a man who'd been shot by someone else and left to die. What's that supposed to mean? Maybe you should ask yourself why a man who supposedly killed his brother would come all the way to Laramie bleeding half to death. What's he looking for here that's worth dying for? I saw something flicker in Morrison's eyes. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. Something that told me Thomas Gray was telling the truth about that evidence. He's not looking for anything, Morrison said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. He's running. Running from justice like the coward he is. Or running toward it. Morrison slammed me against the wall, his face inches from mine, close enough that I could smell whiskey on his breath and see the fear in his eyes. What did he tell you? He demanded. He told me you're a liar, I said clearly, and that you're going to hang for what you've done. The fear in Morrison's eyes turned to panic. This wasn't about catching a murderer anymore. This was about covering up crimes that went back years, maybe decades. Search the saloon, he ordered his men. Every room, every closet, every inch of that building. Find him before he gets away. As they filed out of my destroyed room, Morrison leaned close to my ear one more time. When we catch him, you're going to hang right beside him, he whispered. Accessory to murder. Maybe I'll even say you helped him kill his brother. I waited until they were all gone before I allowed myself to collapse onto my knees. My face throbbed where he'd hit me, and my scalp burned where he'd pulled my hair. But Thomas was free, and somewhere out there, he was going to find my sister and bring her home. I could hear them tearing the red lantern apart, room by room. Furniture being overturned, doors being kicked in, floorboards being pried up with crowbars. Buck Morrison was shouting at someone, probably one of the saloon girls who was asking too many questions. The customers had all fled when the law showed up with guns drawn, leaving the place empty except for the women who worked there and the men who were hunting Thomas. I sat in my ruined room, trying to piece together everything Thomas had told me. June was alive. She'd escaped from whatever hell those men had put her through. She'd found love, found happiness, found a man who treated her with respect and kindness. And then Jacob Gray had taken it all away from her, just like those men in gray coats had taken her away from me 9 years ago. I thought about the envelope of evidence Thomas had shown me. All those names, dates, and amounts of money. If it was real, if it was as damaging as he claimed, then it could bring down more than just Jacob Gray. It could expose an entire network of criminals who had been operating in Wyoming territory for years. But first, Thomas had to survive long enough to get that information to someone who would act on it instead of burying it for money. I heard footsteps coming back toward my room and stood up, trying to look composed. Morrison appeared in my doorway, his face dark with frustration and growing panic. "He's not in the saloon," he admitted through gritted teeth. "But he couldn't have gotten far with that wound. Not on foot. Maybe he's tougher than you gave him credit for," I said. "Maybe he's smarter too." Morrison studied my face like he was trying to read my thoughts, looking for some clue about where Thomas might have gone. "You know something? I can see it in your eyes." "I know a lot of things, Sheriff. I know you're scared. I know you're lying about Thomas Gray. And I know you're going to regret the day you decided to cross me." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, and for a moment I thought he was going to shoot me right there in my own room. But then Deputy Walsh appeared behind him with news that made both of us freeze. "Sheriff, we got a problem. Big problem." Morrison turned to face his deputy. "What kind of problem?" "Telegram just came in from Denver," Walsh said, his voice tight with worry. "Federal marshal's on his way to Laramie. Wants to talk to Thomas Gray about some missing evidence in a murder case." I watched the color drain from Morrison's face, like water from a broken bucket. "Federal marshal?" he repeated, like the words tasted bad in his mouth. "Marshal Garrett says he's investigating corruption in territorial law enforcement. Specifically wants to interview Thomas Gray about evidence relating to the murder of Jacob Gray." Morrison's world was collapsing behind his eyes, and I could see him struggling to figure out what this meant. A federal marshal meant this was bigger than just a local murder case. It meant someone important in Washington was taking an interest in what happened in Wyoming territory. "When's he getting here?" Morrison asked. "Tomorrow morning on the 1st. Train from Denver." Morrison looked at me, then back at Walsh, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "We have to find Gray before then," he said. "What if we can't?" Walsh asked. "Then we better hope he dies from that wound before he can talk to any federal marshals about anything." I felt a chill run down my spine. Morrison wasn't just trying to capture Thomas anymore. He was trying to silence him permanently, along with anyone else who might know about that evidence. "Double the search," Morrison ordered. "Check every building in town. Check the church, the schoolhouse, every barn and shed and outhouse. Put guards on all the roads leading out of town, and put someone at the train station in case Gray tries to meet that marshal." After they left, I sat in the growing darkness thinking about what I'd heard. A federal marshal coming to investigate corruption. That meant Thomas's evidence was real, and someone important already knew about it. But Thomas was wounded and alone, hiding somewhere in a town full of people who wanted him dead. And if Morrison was desperate enough to kill him to keep him quiet, then my sister was in even more danger than before. I had to help. I had to find a way to even the odds. Should Elsie risk everything to help Thomas? Comment below with your thoughts. I waited until full dark before making my move. I could hear Morrison's men still searching the town, their voices carrying on the night air as they moved from building to building with lanterns and guns. I slipped out of my room through the coal chute, following the same path Thomas had taken hours earlier. The cellar under the saloon was dark and full of shadows, but I knew it well enough to navigate by feel. I found the main coal storage area and the outside entrance Thomas would have used. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see scuff marks in the cold dust where someone had recently passed through. But where would he go? He was wounded, possibly feverish, and he didn't know Laramie well enough to find a good hiding place on his own. Then I remembered something. Mrs. Henderson's old house, where I'd learned nursing from the kindest woman I'd ever known. It had been empty since she died 2 years ago, and it was far enough from the main part of town that Morrison's men might not think to look there right away. I made my way through back alleys and side streets, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main roads where the searchers were concentrated. It took me 20 minutes to reach the old Henderson place, a small cabin on the outskirts of town near Willow Creek. The front door was locked, but I knew Mrs. Henderson had always kept a spare key under the loose board on the back porch, in case someone needed medical help when she wasn't home. I found it right where it had always been, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep it from rusting. Inside, the house was dark and dusty, filled with memories of the woman who had taught me that healing was more important than judging. But in the back bedroom, lying on Mrs. Henderson's old bed, I found what I was looking for. Thomas Gray was unconscious and burning with fever. His makeshift bandages were soaked with blood, and his breathing was shallow and labored. I had found him just in time. I lit a candle and examined Thomas's wound by flickering light. The bullet hole had reopened during his escape, and infection was setting in fast. Without proper care, he would be dead by morning. I knew what I had to do, but it meant leaving him alone while I went back for supplies. It was a risk. Morrison's men were still searching, and they might find this place while I was gone. But Thomas was going to die anyway if I didn't get medicine and clean bandages. I covered him with Mrs. Henderson's old quilt and whispered, "I'll be back. Don't you dare die on me before I return." The trip back to the saloon was even more dangerous than the trip out. Morrison had posted guards at key points around town, and I had to move slowly and carefully to avoid being seen. I managed to slip back into my room and gather what I needed. The last of my clean petticoats for bandages, a bottle of whiskey for disinfectant, some herbs Mrs. Henderson had taught me to use for fever, and what little food I could carry. On my way back out, I nearly ran into Deputy Walsh making his rounds behind the saloon. I pressed myself against the wall and held my breath while he walked past, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him. When I got back to the Henderson house, Thomas was awake and delirious with fever. "June," he mumbled as I entered the room. "Have to find June. They took her. Can't let them hurt her anymore." "I'm here," I said softly, not bothering to correct him. In his fevered state, maybe it was kinder to let him think I was his wife. I cleaned his wound as gently as I could and applied fresh bandages. The whiskey made him cry out in pain, but it was necessary to prevent gangrene from setting in. As I worked, he continued to mumble about June, about the evidence he'd gathered, about men in gray coats and corrupt sheriffs. Most of it was incoherent rambling, but some details were clear enough to paint a picture of the conspiracy he'd uncovered. It was bigger than I'd imagined, much bigger. As the night wore on, Thomas's fever began to break. He became more coherent, more aware of where he was and who I was. "Elsie," he said when he saw me changing his bandages by candlelight, "you shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous for you." "Nowhere's safe right now," I replied. "Morrison has the whole town searching for you." "Did they hurt you?" he asked, noticing the bruise on my face where Morrison had hit me. I touched my swollen cheek. "Nothing I can't handle. I've had worse." Thomas struggled to sit up, wincing, as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I have to get out of here. Have to find June before it's too late." "Before what's too late?" His eyes met mine in the candlelight, and I saw fear there that had nothing to do with his own safety. "The letter Jacob left when he took her. It said I had 3 days to turn myself in and hand over the evidence, or they'd kill her." Thomas's voice was grim with certainty. Today was day 3. I felt my heart stop beating for a moment. If Thomas was right, if they really intended to kill June, we have to do something, I said. We? Elsie, this isn't your fight. You've done enough already. She's my sister. Of course it's my fight. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, studying my face in the flickering candlelight. You're just like her, you know. June always said you were the bravest person she knew. I didn't understand what she meant until now. I'm not brave. I'm terrified. But I'm not going to let my sister die if there's anything I can do to save her. Thomas reached into his shirt with shaking hands and pulled out the envelope of evidence. Then you need to understand exactly what we're up against. He opened the envelope and spread the contents on the bed between us. Letters, receipts, official documents, all bearing signatures and seals that looked important. Morrison's people weren't just taking girls for themselves, Thomas explained, his voice growing stronger as he focused on the task. They were selling them to wealthy men all over the territory. Politicians, judges, business owners. Men who paid good money for young women they could abuse without consequences. I felt sick looking at the evidence. Lists of names, amounts of money, dates, and locations. It was a business ledger for human slavery. But some of the girls escaped over the years. Some of them started talking. So Morrison's people began killing them to keep them quiet. And when you gathered all this evidence, Jacob realized I could expose the entire operation. So he took June to keep me quiet, then decided to kill me anyway to be completely safe. I stared at the papers, understanding the full scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just about saving one woman. This was about bringing down a criminal network that had been operating for years, destroying lives for profit. The federal marshal, I said suddenly. He's coming because someone already knows about this. Thomas nodded. I sent a telegram to Washington before Jacob found me. Told them I had evidence of territorial corruption and would meet with their representative. Then why are we hiding? Why don't we just wait for the marshal to arrive? Thomas's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering. Because Morrison will kill June the moment he realizes the federal government is involved. He'll eliminate all the evidence, including the witnesses, including my sister. I looked at the evidence spread across Mrs. Henderson's old quilt, then at Thomas's pale, determined face. What do you need me to do? I asked. Help me get to the train station tomorrow morning. I have to meet that marshal and turn over this evidence before Morrison figures out what's happening. What about June? The marshal will have resources. I don't. Men, authority, the power to force Morrison to tell us where she is. I shook my head. By the time all that legal business happens, she'll be dead. You said it yourself. Morrison will eliminate the evidence. That includes her. Thomas closed his eyes in frustration. Then what do you suggest? I had been thinking about it while I cleaned his wound, while I watched him fight the fever, while I looked at those horrible documents. I think I know where Morrison keeps prisoners he doesn't want the territorial authorities to know about. I said. Thomas's eyes snapped open. What? There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles north of town. The Widow's Peak Mine. It played out years ago, but Morrison's been using it as a private jail for people he wants to disappear. How do you know that? I heard him talking about it once when he was drunk at the saloon. He was bragging to his deputies about having a place where he could keep troublemakers until he decided what to do with them. You think that's where they have June? It's where I keep someone I plan to kill. Remote, hard to find, easy to dispose of evidence afterward. Thomas tried to get up, but I pushed him back down. You can barely stand, let alone ride 5 miles and fight whoever's guarding her. Then, what? I'll go. Absolutely not. Listen to me, I said firmly. Morrison's men are looking for you, not me. I can get close to that mine without being shot on sight. I can find out if June's there, and if she is, I can get her out. It's too dangerous. If they catch you, if they catch me, At least June won't die alone, I said. And you'll still be alive to meet that marshal and bring these bastards to justice. Thomas stared at me for a long moment. Even if you could get her out, then what? Morrison will just hunt you both down. That's where you come in. You meet the federal marshal, turn over the evidence, and bring him back with enough men to arrest Morrison and his whole crew. And if something goes wrong, if they catch you at the mine, I thought about that possibility. If they caught me, I'd probably end up in that mine shaft with June. Or worse. Then at least I'll have tried, I said. At least I won't spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved her. We spent the rest of the night planning. Thomas would stay hidden at the Henderson house until just before the train arrived, then make his way to the station. I would leave at first light for the Widow's Peak mine. Thomas insisted on giving me his pistol, a Colt .45 that he'd managed to keep hidden during his escape from the saloon. Do you know how to use it? He asked. Mrs. Henderson taught me. Said a woman living alone needed to know how to protect herself from men who might think she was helpless. I checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. I hoped that would be enough for whatever I might face. Thomas also gave me a letter he'd written to the federal marshal, explaining where I'd gone and what I was trying to do. If something happens to me, before I can meet Marshal Garrett, he said, make sure he gets this. He'll know what to do with the evidence. As dawn approached, we said our goodbyes. Thomas took my hand and squeezed it gently. June always said her sister was her hero, he told me. Now I understand why. Just promise me you'll survive long enough to meet that marshal. Don't let Morrison find you before then. I promise. I left him there in Mrs. Henderson's old house, pale but determined, clutching the evidence that could save my sister and bring down a network of killers. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. I borrowed a horse from the livery stable, Old. Pete, who worked there, owed me a favor from when I'd helped nurse his sick wife through consumption. He didn't ask questions when I told him I needed to ride out early to visit someone. The Widow's Peak mine was 5 miles north of town, up in the hills where gold prospectors had once dreamed of striking it rich. The ride took me through country I'd known since childhood, but it looked different in the early morning light. More dangerous, full of shadows where armed men might be hiding. I followed the old mining road until I could see the wooden structures. Around the mine entrance, there were 3 horses tied up outside what used to be the foreman's office, and smoke rising from the chimney. 3 guards, at least. Maybe more inside the buildings or down in the mine itself. I left my horse tied to a tree about a quarter mile away and approached on foot, using the scrub brush and rock outcroppings for cover. Thomas's pistol felt heavy and awkward in my hand, but reassuring too. As I got closer, I could hear voices. Men talking and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Should be getting word from Morrison soon, one of them was saying. About time, another replied. I'm getting tired of babysitting prisoners, especially ones that won't stop crying and begging. My heart jumped. Prisoners. That had to mean June was here. But how many guards were there really? And how was I going to get past them? I worked my way around to the back of the mine complex, where the old equipment sheds provided better cover. From there, I could see the entrance to the main shaft and most of the surrounding buildings. I counted 4 men total, 2 sitting outside the foreman's office, playing cards and drinking coffee from tin cups. 1 more patrolling the perimeter with a rifle slung over his shoulder. And a 4th man I could see through the window of the office, apparently keeping watch from inside. The mine shaft itself was blocked by a heavy wooden door with a large padlock. If June was being held prisoner, that's where she'd be. I watched the guards' routine for about an hour, learning their patterns. The patrol guard made a circuit of the entire complex every 20 minutes or so. The card players seemed content to stay put unless something disturbed them. The man inside came to the window occasionally, but mostly stayed out of sight. My best chance would be when the patrol guard was on the far side of the complex, with his back to the mine entrance. I'd have maybe 5 minutes to get that door open, get June out, and get away before he came back around. But first, I had to deal with that padlock. I remembered seeing a tool shed during my reconnaissance. If I was lucky, there might be something in there I could use. Bolt cutters, maybe, or at least a crowbar heavy enough to break the lock. I waited for the patrol guard to start his next circuit, then moved quickly to the tool shed. The door was unlocked, and inside I found exactly what I needed: a pair of heavy bolt cutters that looked like they could handle the padlock. I also found something else that made my blood run cold: a pile of women's clothing, torn and bloodstained. Evidence of what had happened to other prisoners who'd been brought here over the years. I was not going to let that happen to June. Not while there was breath in my body. I positioned myself near the mine entrance and waited for the patrol guard to reach the farthest point of his circuit. When I saw him disappear behind the equipment shed, I made my move. I ran to the heavy wooden door and attacked the padlock with the bolt cutters. The metal was thick and stubborn, but the cutters were sharp and I was desperate. Come on, I thought as I squeezed the handles with all my strength. The lock snapped just as I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Hey, what the hell are you doing there? I spun around to see one of the card players approaching with his gun drawn. The other one was right behind him, moving fast. Looking for my sister, I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my heart hammered against my ribs. Ain't no sister of yours in there, girl. That's private property, and you're trespassing. Then you won't mind if I take a look. I pulled the broken padlock off the door and started to pull it open. The rusty hinges creaked loudly in the morning air. Stop right there, the guard ordered, raising his pistol to aim at my chest. Take one more step and I'll put a bullet in you. I looked at him, then at his partner, then at the dark opening behind the door. June, I called into the darkness. June, are you in there? Elsie. A voice came from deep in the mine shaft, weak and frightened, but unmistakably familiar. Elsie, is that really you? My sister was alive. She was really alive. I'm here, June. I called back. I'm going to get you out. That's when the guard decided to shoot at me. Are you rooting for Elsie? Comment, save June, to show your support. The bullet missed me by inches, splintering the wooden door frame and sending splinters flying. I dove to the side and rolled behind a pile of old mining equipment, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the sound of gunfire. You made a big mistake coming here, girl, one of the guards shouted. Now you get to join your sister in that hole in the ground. I heard them moving, trying to get a better angle on my hiding place. Where was the patrol guard? And what about the fourth man I'd seen in the office? I found out when a rifle shot kicked up dirt near my feet. The patrol guard had heard the shooting and was now positioned on higher ground, with a clear view of the area around the mine entrance. The fourth man had also emerged from the office, carrying a shotgun. I was pinned down, outnumbered 4-1, and my sister was trapped in a mine shaft that could become her tomb if these men decided to just collapse the entrance and bury the evidence. I had to even the odds somehow. I remembered the tool shed, full of old mining supplies and equipment. Some of that equipment might be useful for more than just cutting locks. During a lull in the shooting, I made a dash for the shed. Bullets whined around me like angry wasps, but I made it to cover without being hit. Inside the shed, I found what I was looking for: a case of old mining charges, probably left over from when they were still blasting rock in the tunnels. I'd never used explosives before, but I'd watched the miners work when I was younger. Light the fuse, throw it where you want it to explode, take cover. How hard could it be? I grabbed 3 of the mining charges and checked the fuses. They looked old, but serviceable. I found matches in my pocket. I always carried them for lighting candles and lamps at work. My plan was simple and probably suicidal. I'd light the charges and throw them toward the guards' positions, hopefully scattering them long enough for me to get to June. If it didn't work, at least we'd die together instead of her dying alone. I lit the first fuse and counted to 3. then hurled the charge toward the foreman's office where two of the guards were taking cover. The explosion was much louder than I'd expected. It shattered the windows of the office and sent debris flying in all directions. I heard men shouting and cursing, but I couldn't tell if anyone had been hurt. I didn't wait to find out. I lit the second charge and threw it toward the high ground where the rifleman was positioned. "June," I called as I ran for the mine entrance. "Where are you exactly?" "Here." Her voice came from deeper in the tunnel. "I'm chained to the wall about 50 yards in." I plunged into the darkness, following her voice and feeling my way along the rough stone walls. The mine shaft was deeper than I'd expected, sloping down into the mountain. The air was stale and cold, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the blackness. Behind me, I heard the guards shouting to each other, trying to regroup after the explosions. "She's in the mine," one of them yelled. "Cut her off before she gets too deep." I found June about where she'd said, shackled to an iron ring that had been driven into the rock wall. Even in the dim light that filtered down from the entrance, I could see she'd been badly treated. Her clothes were torn, her face was bruised, and she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. But she was alive. My sister was alive, and I was going to get her out of here. "Elsie," she whispered as I knelt beside her. "I knew you'd come. I never stopped believing you'd find me." I fumbled with the shackles, trying to find a way to get them off. They were held with another padlock, smaller than the one on the door, but just as sturdy. "Hold still," I told her, pulling out Thomas's pistol. "I'm going to shoot the lock off." "Wait," June said, grabbing my arm. "There are others. Deeper in the mine. We can't leave them. Other prisoners." Of course there would be other prisoners. "How many?" I asked. "3 that I know of. Maybe more. I can't be sure in the dark." I heard shouting from the mine entrance, getting closer. The guards had recovered from the explosions and were coming after us. I had to make a choice. Get June out now while we still could, or try to save all the prisoners and risk losing everyone. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Show me where they are," I said. June led me deeper into the mine, her chains clanking with every step. The tunnel branched off in several directions, creating a maze of passages that would be easy to get lost in if you didn't know the way. "This way," she whispered, pulling me down a side passage. I could hear the guards entering the mine behind us, their voices echoing off the stone walls. They had lanterns, which meant they could see better than we could, but it also meant we could track their movements by the light. "How many of them came in?" one of the guards was saying. "Just the one girl, far as I can tell. But she's got explosives, and she knows how to use them." "Then we better finish this quick, before she brings the whole mountain down on our heads." June stopped at what looked like a natural cavern that had been enlarged by the miners. Inside, I could see 3 shapes huddled against the far wall. "It's all right," June called softly to them. "Help is here." As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out 3 young women, all of them chained like June had been. They looked to be between 16 and 20 years old, and they all had the same haunted look I'd seen in June's eyes. "Who are you?" one of them whispered. "Someone who's getting you out of here," I replied, examining their shackles. The locks were all similar to the one that had held June. I could shoot them off, but the noise would definitely attract the guards. "Is there another way out of here?" I asked. "There's an old ventilation shaft that leads to the surface," one of the girls said. "But it's narrow, and it comes out near where the guards were camped." She pointed to a dark opening near the back of the cavern. It looked barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. I heard the guards getting closer, their lantern light beginning to reflect off the walls of our passage. I made my decision. I lit the fuse on my third and final mining charge. "Everyone get back," I ordered, then threw the charge toward the entrance to the cavern. The explosion collapsed part of the tunnel, blocking the passage and buying us time. But it also trapped us in the cavern with only the narrow ventilation shaft as an escape route. "Can you all fit through that shaft?" I asked. We can try, June said. But what about the chains? I raised Thomas's pistol and checked the cylinder. 3 bullets left. For women to free. Cover your ears, I said. I shot the locks off one by one, the sound of gunfire echoing through the cavern like thunder. Each shot made the girls flinch, but they held still while I freed them from their chains. The shaft, I said when the last lock was destroyed. Everyone through now. The youngest girl went first, crawling into the narrow opening. June went next, then the other 2. I brought up the rear, pushing Thomas's pistol ahead of me as I squeezed through the tight space. The ventilation shaft was even narrower than it had looked from the cavern. I had to crawl on my belly, using my elbows to pull myself forward. The walls pressed in on all sides, and I could barely breathe in the stale air. But I could see light. Ahead, real sunlight, not the flickering glow of lanterns. We crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I heard the girl in front of me gasp with relief. I'm out, she called back. One by one, they emerged from the shaft onto the mountainside above the mine complex. When I finally pulled myself out into the fresh air, I could see we were about 100 yards uphill from the guards' camp. The 3 girls I didn't know looked at me with expressions of gratitude and disbelief. Thank you, one of them whispered. We thought we were going to die in there. You're not dead yet, I replied, looking down at the mine entrance where the guards were probably still trying to dig through the collapsed tunnel. But we need to get out of here before they realize where we went. June took my hand and squeezed it tight. Elsie, I can't believe it's really you. After all these years. We'll have time to catch up later, I said. Right now, we need to get back to town before Morrison figures out what happened. Back to town? One of the girls asked. But won't they just capture us again? I thought about Thomas, about the federal marshal who was supposed to arrive this morning, about the evidence that could bring down the entire criminal network. Not if everything goes according to plan, I said. But as we started down the mountain, toward where I'd left my horse, I heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road below. Riders, moving fast in our direction. Either help was coming, or we were about to be recaptured by Morrison's men. I guess we were about to find out which. The riders were Morrison's men. I could tell by the way they rode, hard and purposeful, like hunters chasing wounded prey. There were at least 8 of them, maybe more. Hide, I whispered to the girls, pushing them toward a cluster of rocks near the ventilation shaft. Don't move until I tell you. I crept closer to the edge of the ridge and peered down at the riders. Morrison himself was in the lead, his face grim with determination. Behind him rode Deputy Walsh and several other men I recognized from town. They'd found my horse. I watched Morrison dismount and examine the tracks around the tree where I'd tied the mare. He was a good tracker, probably learned during his years hunting outlaws across the territory. She's here somewhere, I heard him tell his men. Spread out and search. She can't have gotten far on foot, especially with prisoners to slow her down. What about the mine? Walsh asked. Briggs and his boys will handle that. They know these tunnels better than anyone. I realized with growing dread that Morrison had more men than I'd thought. The guards at the mine were just part of a larger force. He'd brought enough firepower to fight a small war. But where was Thomas? He should have been at the train station by now, meeting with the federal marshal. Unless something had gone wrong. Unless Morrison had caught him first. I crawled back to where the girls were hiding and whispered the situation to them. 4 terrified young women, weak from captivity, against at least a dozen armed men who knew the country better than we did. There's a creek about a mile east of here, June whispered. If we can get there, we can follow it downstream back toward town. The water will hide our tracks. It was a good plan, but it meant crossing open ground where we could easily be spotted. Can you all run? I asked. They nodded, though I could see the fear in their eyes. Then stay low, stay quiet, and follow me. We started down the backside of the ridge, away from the mine and the searching men. The ground was rough and rocky, treacherous for people trying to move quickly and quietly. Behind us, I could hear Morrison's men calling to each other as they searched the area around my horse. It wouldn't be long before they found the ventilation shaft and realized how we'd escaped. We were halfway to the creek when I heard the shout that chilled my blood. There, on the ridge, Morrison's voice, loud and angry. He'd spotted us. Run, I told the girls. Run for the creek. We ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. Behind us, I could hear horses crashing through the brush, men shouting orders, the sound of weapons being cocked and loaded. The youngest girl stumbled and fell, crying out as she hit the rocky ground. I helped her up, feeling blood on her scraped knees. I can't, she gasped. I can't run anymore. Yes, you can, I told her firmly. You survived that mine. You can survive this too. June appeared on her other side, supporting her weight. We all run together, or we all die together. I could see the creek ahead, a line of green vegetation, marking its path through the brown hills. But I could also see dust clouds behind us, getting closer every second. There, one of the guards shouted from behind us. By the creek, a rifle shot cracked across the morning air. The bullet hit a rock near my feet, sending stone fragments flying. We reached the creek bank just as the first rider appeared on the ridge behind us. I pushed the girls into the water and followed them, feeling the cold mountain stream soak through my clothes. Follow the creek downstream, I ordered. Stay in the water. Don't leave any tracks on the banks. The water was knee-deep in most places, deeper in others. The current was strong enough to make walking difficult, but it would hide our scent from any tracking dogs Morrison might have. Behind us, I could hear the riders reaching the creek. Morrison was shouting orders, dividing his men to search both directions along the water. They went downstream. I heard Deputy Walsh call. I can see disturbed water where they crossed. Of course they could track us even in the creek. These men weren't amateurs, but maybe I could buy us some time. I pulled Thomas's pistol from my belt and fired my last 3 shots back toward our pursuers. I wasn't trying to hit anyone. I just wanted to slow them down, make them cautious about following too closely. Keep going, I told the girls. I'll catch up. I waited until they disappeared around a bend in the creek, then turned and ran downstream after them, splashing through the cold water as fast as I could move. We had maybe a 10-minute head start now. It would have to be enough. We followed the creek for about a mile before I called a halt. The girls were exhausted, shivering from the cold water and the shock of their escape. We can't keep running like this, June said, voicing what we all knew. They'll catch us eventually. She was right. Morrison's men were mounted, well armed, and they knew the territory. We were on foot, lightly armed, and burdened with women who'd been prisoners for weeks or months. There's a way, I said, thinking desperately. But it's risky. Riskier than being caught, one of the girls asked. I looked back upstream, where I could see dust clouds marking our pursuers' approach. We split up, I said. 3 of you continue. Downstream toward town. Try to reach the church. Reverend Coleman may be a hypocrite, but he won't turn away women seeking sanctuary, not with the whole town watching. What about you and June? The youngest girl asked. We're going back. June stared at me. Back where? To town. To find Thomas and that federal marshal. If Thomas is still alive, if the marshal actually arrived, then we might be able to end this thing once and for all. Elsie, that's suicide. Maybe. But if Thomas was captured, if the marshal doesn't get the evidence he needs, then Morrison wins. All those women die for nothing, and men like him keep operating forever. June looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. We have to try. I turned to the other 3 girls. Follow the creek to town. Find the church. Find help. Tell them what happened here. Can you do that? They nodded, though I could see the fear in their eyes at the thought of being on their own. Go, I said, and stay together. Look out for each other. I watched them disappear around a bend in the creek, then turned to June. Ready to go back into hell? I asked. I've been there before, she replied. This time, I'm not going alone. We left the creek and made our way overland toward Laramie, staying off the main roads and using the broken terrain for cover. It took us 2 hours to get within sight of town, moving carefully to avoid Morrison's searchers. When we reached the outskirts, I could see something was wrong. There were too many men on the streets, all of them armed, all of them moving with purpose. Morrison had turned the whole town into a prison camp. Where would Thomas be? June asked, as we hid behind an abandoned barn. Mrs. Henderson's old house, if he's still free. The train station, if he made it to meet the marshal. And if he was caught. I didn't want to think about that possibility. Then we're on our own. We worked our way through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where Morrison's men were patrolling. The town felt different, hostile, dangerous, like a place where strangers weren't welcome. When we reached Mrs. Henderson's house, I could see immediately that something had happened. The front door was standing open, and there were signs of a struggle inside. He's not here, I said, feeling my heart sink. Then where? The sound of a train whistle cut through the morning air. The Denver train arriving at the station. The marshal, I said. If Thomas is still alive, that's where he'll be. We made our way toward the train station, but as we got closer, I could see it was surrounded by Morrison's men. They had the whole area cordoned off. We'll never get through, June said. That's when I heard the gunshots. The gunfire was coming from the direction of the train station. Not just a few shots, but a sustained battle between multiple groups of armed men. Thomas, I whispered, hoping he was still alive to fight. June and I worked our way closer, using buildings for cover. When we reached the corner of Main Street, I could see what was happening. Thomas Gray was crouched behind a water trough near the train platform, blood seeping through his shirt, but still returning fire. Across from him, Sheriff Morrison and 3 deputies had taken positions behind the station house. But there were others too, men in federal uniforms who could only be U.S. Marshals, positioned around the platform with military precision. Thomas made it, I breathed. He got the evidence to the marshal. One of the federal men, a tall, distinguished-looking officer with silver hair, was shouting orders to Morrison. This is Marshal Garrett. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender. Morrison's response was another volley of gunfire. We have to help, June said. How? We don't have any weapons left. But even as I said it, I was scanning the area for anything that might give us an advantage. That's when I spotted the solution. The railroad water tower. See that water tower? I pointed to the tall wooden structure that supplied water to the steam engines. If we can get up there, we can see the whole battle. Maybe find a way to help. That's your plan? Climb a water tower. You got a better idea? June looked at the ongoing gunfight, then at the water tower. How do we get there without being shot? The same way we got out of that mine. Carefully. We worked our way around the back of the buildings, staying low, and moving when the gunfire was loudest. It took us 10 minutes to reach the base of the water tower. The ladder was old and rusty, but it held our weight. As we climbed, I could see more of the battle unfolding below. Marshal Garrett had brought at least a dozen men with him. They had Morrison's group outnumbered and outgunned, but Morrison had the advantage of cover and local knowledge. From our vantage point, I could also see something the marshals couldn't. 2 of Morrison's men were working their way around behind the federal positions, probably planning to attack from the rear. Thomas, I shouted as loud as I could. Behind the freight shed, I saw Thomas look up, spot the flanking movement, and redirect his fire. One of Morrison's men went down immediately, but my shout had also revealed our position. Morrison himself looked up and saw us on the water tower. There, he yelled to his remaining men. The Fletcher girls. Kill them both. Bullets started, hitting the wooden water tank above our heads, sending splinters flying in all directions. "This was a terrible plan," June said. "I'm open to suggestions." That's when I noticed the valve wheel at the base of the water tank. A big brass fitting that controlled the flow of water to the railroad spigot below. "Hold on tight," I told June, and gave the valve wheel a hard turn. Water erupted from the spigot like a geyser, sending thousands of gallons cascading down onto the street below. Within seconds, the area around the train station was flooding. Morrison's men, who had been using overturned carts and crates for cover, suddenly found themselves standing in knee-deep, rapidly flowing water. Their positions became untenable as the floods swept away their protection. "Now," I heard Marshal Garrett shout, "take them while they're scattered." The federal marshals moved in quickly, their superior numbers and training telling in the chaos. Within minutes, it was over. I watched from the water tower as Morrison and his surviving men were surrounded and disarmed. The sheriff who had terrorized our town for years was finally finished. But where was Thomas? I scanned the flooded street and spotted him slumped against the water trough, no longer returning fire. Even from this distance, I could see he was hurt badly. "June," I said, "we need to get down there." We climbed down from the water tower as fast as we dared. By the time we reached the street, Marshal Garrett's men had secured the area and were taking Morrison and his deputies into custody. I ran to where Thomas was leaning against the water trough, pale and bleeding but alive. "You made it," he said weakly when he saw me. "You found her." "We found each other," I replied, kneeling beside him to examine his wounds. That's when June appeared beside us. For a moment, Thomas didn't recognize her. She was thinner than when he'd last seen her, marked by her ordeal, but still unmistakably the woman he'd married. "June," he whispered, reaching out to touch her face like he couldn't believe she was real. "I'm here," she said, taking his hand. "We're both here." Marshal Garrett approached us, a stern-faced man with intelligent eyes who radiated authority. "You must be Miss Fletcher," he said to me. "Thomas Gray told me about you. Said you risked everything to help him." "I did what anyone should have done," I replied. "But most people didn't. That's what makes it remarkable." He looked at June, then back at me. "We found the evidence Mr. Gray gathered. It's even more extensive than we'd hoped. This conspiracy reaches into multiple territories, involving dozens of corrupt officials." "What about the other girls?" I asked. "The ones from the mine. Already in federal custody, being cared for by Army doctors. They'll be safe now." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was finally over. Over the next few hours, as Thomas was treated by the Army surgeon who'd accompanied Marshal Garrett, the full scope of Morrison's criminal network became clear. The evidence Thomas had gathered contained records going back years, lists of names, financial transactions, correspondence between corrupt officials in multiple territories. It was enough to bring down not just Morrison, but an entire system of corruption that had operated with impunity. "Your sister's husband is a brave man," Marshal Garrett told me as we watched the surgeon work on Thomas. "He could have taken this information and disappeared somewhere safe. Instead, he came here to rescue his wife and expose these criminals. He loves her," I said simply. "Love makes people do brave things." "Indeed it does. And so does justice." The marshal showed me some of the documents Thomas had collected. Names I recognized, territorial officials, judges, even some federal appointees who had been taking bribes to ignore the trafficking. "How many girls?" I asked. "We estimate at least 100 over the past 5 years, based on these records. Maybe more whose names were never written down. 100 young women, stolen from their families and sold like livestock." The magnitude of it was almost incomprehensible. "What happens now?" "Now we prosecute everyone involved, from the lowest level enforcers to the highest ranking officials. This is going to be the largest corruption trial in territorial history." I looked at Morrison, now in shackles and guarded by federal marshals. The man who had terrorized our town for years looked smaller somehow, diminished by his defeat. Will you need us to testify? Extensively. Your testimony about what you witnessed, combined with the documentary evidence and statements from the rescued victims, should be enough to convict everyone involved. It was going to be a long process, but justice would finally be served. Thomas survived his wounds, though it took weeks of careful nursing. June rarely left his side during his recovery, and I could see their love growing stronger through the ordeal they'd shared. The other girls we'd rescued from the mine were housed temporarily in the church, under federal protection, while arrangements were made for their care. Some had families they could return to. Others would need help building new lives. Reverend Coleman, to his credit, had opened the church doors without hesitation when the 3 girls I'd sent downstream arrived seeking sanctuary. He even delivered a sermon the following Sunday about the Good Samaritan and the duty to help those in need. I was wrong, he told me privately after the service. About many things. Your father was a good man who deserved better treatment from this community. It was an apology I'd never expected to receive, but it meant something to hear it. The town of Laramie itself was changing. With Morrison's corruption exposed, new leadership emerged. People who had been too frightened to speak up before began demanding better law enforcement, better treatment of the vulnerable, better justice for all. It wasn't a transformation that happened overnight, but it was real and lasting. Marshal Garrett established a permanent federal presence in the territory, with agents specifically tasked with investigating corruption and protecting victims of trafficking. It was the beginning of a new era of law enforcement in the American West. The trials began 6 months later in Denver, drawing newspaper reporters from across the country. It was the biggest legal proceeding in Colorado Territory history, with dozens of defendants and hundreds of witnesses. I testified for 3 days, describing everything I'd witnessed, finding Thomas bleeding in the street, Morrison's threats and violence, the rescue at the mine, the evidence of the trafficking operation. June's testimony was even more powerful. She spoke quietly but clearly about her 9 years of captivity, her escape, her marriage to Thomas, and her recapture by Jacob Gray. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when she finished. Thomas, still weak from his injuries but determined to see justice done, presented the documentary evidence he'd gathered. The prosecution used his records to trace the flow of money and victims through the criminal network. One by one, the conspirators were convicted. Morrison received life in prison for multiple counts of kidnapping, conspiracy, and corruption. His deputies received terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. The corrupt officials in other territories faced separate trials, but the evidence was so overwhelming that most pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. Jacob Gray, who had started it all by taking June and trying to kill Thomas, was sentenced to hang for murder. The sentence was carried out 3 months later. Justice was finally served, but it had taken far too long and cost far too much. With the trials concluded, life began to return to normal, or what passed for normal in a territory that had been shaken to its foundation by the corruption scandal. Thomas and June decided to stay in Laramie, at least for a while. Thomas had been offered a position as a federal investigator, tasked with rooting out similar corruption in other territories. Someone has to do this work, he told me. Make sure what happened here doesn't happen somewhere else. June supported his decision, though I could see the worry in her eyes. She'd already lost too many years to violence and corruption. As for me, I found myself at a crossroads. The Red Lantern Saloon had closed during the scandal. Buck Morrison fled town when his cousin was arrested, and without management, the business collapsed. I could have found work at another saloon, or perhaps as a housekeeper for one of the town's respectable families. But I had different ideas. Marshal Garrett had asked me to consider working with the federal investigators, helping to identify and rescue trafficking victims. It was dangerous work, but it was also important work. "You have a gift for this," he told me. "Not everyone can gain the trust of victims the way you did with those girls in the mine. We need people like you." It was an opportunity I'd never imagined, but one that felt right. I accepted Marshall Garrett's offer and began training as a federal agent specializing in human trafficking cases. It was unlike anything I'd ever done, but the skills I'd learned as a saloon maid, reading people, staying calm under pressure, thinking quickly in dangerous situations, served me well. My first assignment was in Denver, working with local law enforcement to identify and shut down a brothel that was using kidnapped women. The operation was smaller than Morrison's network, but just as cruel, using the techniques I'd learned rescuing June and the other girls. I was able to gain the trust of the victims and gather evidence against their captors. Within 2 months, we'd arrested the perpetrators and freed 8 women. It was satisfying work, but also heartbreaking. Each case reminded me of June's ordeal, of the years she'd lost, of all the women who hadn't been as fortunate as she was. "How do you stand it?" June asked me during one of my visits back to Laramie. "Seeing all that suffering, all that evil, the same way you stood 9 years of captivity," I replied, "by focusing on the hope that things can get better." And they were getting better, slowly but surely. The publicity from the Morrison trials had raised awareness about human trafficking throughout the West. Other law enforcement agencies were taking the issue more seriously, and new laws were being passed to combat the problem. Each rescued victim, each arrested trafficker, each corrupt official removed from office was a step toward a more just society. Over the next 2 years, I worked cases throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. The Federal Anti-Trafficking Unit grew from a handful of agents to a full department with offices in multiple cities. We developed new techniques for identifying trafficking operations, new methods for gaining victims' trust, new strategies for building legal cases that would stand up in court. I also began training other agents, passing on the lessons I'd learned. From my experiences, many of them were women. The federal government had discovered that female agents were often more effective at gaining victims' trust and gathering intelligence. "You're building something important here," Marshall Garrett told me during one of our quarterly reviews. "A new approach to law enforcement that puts victims first." It was true. Traditional law enforcement had focused on punishment after crimes were committed. Our approach emphasized prevention and victim care, trying to stop trafficking before it happened and providing comprehensive support to survivors. The work took me all over the West, to mining camps where immigrant workers were being exploited, to railroad towns where young women were being forced into prostitution, to remote ranches where Native American children were being held as unpaid laborers. Each case was different, but they all shared common elements. Vulnerable people being exploited by those with power, corruption enabling the abuse, and communities choosing to look the other way rather than get involved. The solution was always the same: shine light on the darkness, give voice to the voiceless, and hold the powerful accountable for their actions. In 1885, 3 years after that day in front of the Red Lantern Saloon, I received a letter that would change my life again. It was from President Grover Cleveland himself, inviting me to Washington, D.C., to receive a commendation for extraordinary service in the cause of justice and human dignity. "The president wants to meet me?" I asked Thomas, who had delivered the letter to my hotel room in Denver. "Apparently so. Your work has attracted national attention. Congress is considering new legislation to combat human trafficking throughout the territories, and they want your input on how to make it effective." I looked at the formal invitation with its official seals and important language. It seemed impossible that a former saloon maid from Laramie would be consulted by the federal government on matters of national policy. "Will you go?" June asked when I showed her the letter. I thought about it. The trip to Washington would take weeks, and I'd be away from active casework during a critical time. We were in the middle of a major investigation involving trafficking, rings in 3 different states. But I also thought about all the women who were still trapped in situations like the one June had endured. If I could influence national policy, if I could help create laws that would protect them, I'll go, I decided. This is bigger than any individual case. Washington, D.C. was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The buildings were grander, the people more formally dressed, the pace of life somehow both faster and more deliberate than anything I'd known in the West. President Cleveland was a thoughtful man who listened carefully to my testimony about trafficking operations and asked intelligent questions about enforcement strategies. "Miss Fletcher," he said during our private meeting, "your courage in standing up to corruption and violence has inspired people across the nation. But I'm told it all started with a simple act of mercy, helping a wounded man in the street." Yes, sir. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Indeed they do. That's why I want to ask you to consider taking on a larger role in this fight. He offered me a position as a special advisor to the Department of Justice, working specifically on issues related to human trafficking and victim assistance. It was an honor I had never imagined receiving, but I knew I couldn't accept. Thank you, Mr. President, but my place is in the field with the agents and the victims. The real work isn't done in government offices. It's done on the streets and in the safe houses, one person at a time. He smiled. I had a feeling you'd say that. It's exactly why you're the right person for this fight. The legislation that resulted from our discussions became known as the Cleveland Act, creating federal penalties for human trafficking and providing funding for victim assistance programs. It wasn't perfect, but it was a crucial step forward. By 1886, our anti-trafficking efforts had grown into a network spanning multiple territories. We had agents in every major city, safe houses for victims, and partnerships with local law enforcement agencies. The work was dangerous and often thankless. We faced resistance from corrupt officials, threats from criminal organizations, and skepticism from communities that preferred to ignore uncomfortable truths. But we also saw victories. Hundreds of victims rescued. Dozens of trafficking operations shut down. Corrupt officials removed from office and prosecuted. Most importantly, we were changing attitudes. What had once been seen as an unfortunate but inevitable part of frontier life was now recognized as a serious crime that demanded action. "You've built something that will outlast all of us," Marshall Garrett told me during what would be our final meeting before his retirement. "A system that protects the vulnerable instead of ignoring them." I thought about that assessment as I prepared to take over leadership of the Federal Anti-Trafficking Unit. At 37, I was young for such a position, but my experience was unmatched. The work would continue to evolve. New forms of trafficking were emerging as the country industrialized. Factory owners were exploiting immigrant workers. Mining companies were using virtual slave labor. The fight for human dignity was far from over. But we had proven that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose to act, with courage and compassion. In 1887, 5 years after the events that had changed my life, I returned to Laramie for the dedication of a memorial to victims of human trafficking. The memorial was simple, a bronze plaque mounted on a stone pillar in the town square, but the words were powerful. "In memory of all those who suffered in silence, and in honor of those who chose to speak for the voiceless. May their courage inspire us to build a more just world." The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the women we'd rescued over the years. Some had married and started families. Others had pursued education or careers. All of them had found ways to rebuild their lives after surviving unimaginable trauma. June was there with Thomas and their 2 young children, a boy and a girl. They'd named Hope, after the quality that had sustained them through their darkest times. Do you ever regret it? June asked me as we stood together watching the ceremony. Giving up the chance for a normal life, I mean. Marriage, children, all of that. I thought about her question seriously. I was 38 years old, unmarried, with no children of my own. My life had been consumed by the work of fighting trafficking and helping survivors. But as I looked around at the women we'd helped, some now living ordinary, peaceful lives they'd never thought possible, I knew I had made the right choice. This is my family, I said, gesturing toward the crowd. These women, this work, this fight for justice. I couldn't be happier. June squeezed my hand. I'm proud to be your sister, Elsie Fletcher. And I'm proud to be yours, June Gray. The memorial dedication was covered by newspapers across the country, bringing national attention to the issue of human trafficking and the work we were doing to combat it. In the months that followed, I received hundreds of letters from people who had been inspired by our story. Some were from law enforcement officers who wanted to join our efforts. Others were from citizens who had witnessed suspicious activities and wanted to report them. But the letters that moved me most were from survivors, women who had escaped trafficking situations, sometimes years earlier, and wanted to share their stories. One letter, from a woman in San Francisco, particularly touched me. Dear Miss Fletcher, she wrote, I wanted you to know that your work saved my life, even though we've never met. 3 years ago, I was being held against my will in a brothel in Chinatown. I had given up hope of ever escaping. Then I heard about your federal agents, about how they were helping women like me. I found the courage to reach out for help, and they rescued me from that place. Today, I run my own laundry business and am married to a good man who treats me with respect. None of this would have been possible without the work you started in Laramie. Thank you for showing the world that every person has value, regardless of their circumstances. Letters like that reminded me why the work was important, why the risks and sacrifices were worthwhile. As the 1880s drew to a close, the nature of human trafficking was changing. The old patterns of frontier exploitation were giving way to new forms of abuse as America industrialized. Factory owners in eastern cities were importing workers under false pretenses, then holding them in debt bondage. Railroad companies were using similar tactics with Chinese and Irish immigrants. Mining corporations were essentially enslaving Native Americans and Mexican workers. Our anti-trafficking unit had to evolve to meet these new challenges. We developed partnerships with labor organizations, immigrant rights groups, and tribal leaders. We expanded our operations to cover not just the Western territories, but the entire United States. The work was becoming more complex, but also more effective. We had learned that trafficking couldn't be stopped by law enforcement alone. It required changes in laws, attitudes, and economic systems. In 1889, I was promoted to director of the Federal Anti-Trafficking Bureau, making me one of the highest-ranking women in federal law enforcement. It was a position that came with significant responsibility and even greater challenges. The work is just beginning, I told my staff during my first address as director. We've proven that trafficking can be fought and won. Now we have to prove it can be prevented. Prevention meant addressing the root causes of vulnerability, poverty, discrimination, lack of education, social isolation. It meant building systems that protected people before they became victims. It was ambitious work, but I had learned that ambitious goals were achievable when enough people committed to pursuing them. As 1890 arrived, I found myself reflecting on the 8 years that had passed since that morning when I knelt beside a dying cowboy in the dust outside the Red Lantern Saloon. The work had taken me farther from home than I'd ever imagined possible. I testified before Congress, advised presidents, and built a federal agency from nothing. I'd traveled across the country and met people from every walk of life. But at its core, my story was still simple. I'd seen someone who needed help, and I'd helped. Everything else, The federal appointment, the national recognition, the hundreds of lives saved, had grown from that single seed of compassion. During a quiet moment in my Washington office, I pulled out the letter Thomas had written to Marshall Garrett all those years ago, the one explaining our situation and asking for help. I'd kept it as a reminder of where everything started. Rereading it, I was struck by the desperation in Thomas's words, the slim hope he'd placed in the possibility that someone in authority might actually care about justice. That hope had been justified, but only because ordinary people had chosen to act with extraordinary courage. Marshall Garrett could have ignored the telegram. I could have walked past Thomas's bleeding body. June could have given up during her years of captivity. Any one of those choices, made differently, would have changed everything. The work of fighting human trafficking continued into the 1890s, adapting to new challenges and expanding into new areas. We established permanent offices in major cities, trained local law enforcement agencies, and built networks of safe houses and support services. The Federal Anti-Trafficking Bureau became a model for law enforcement agencies around the world. Delegations from Europe and South America visited our offices to learn our methods and adapt them to their own contexts. But success brought new challenges. Criminal organizations adapted their tactics, becoming more sophisticated and more difficult to detect. Corruption found new forms and new hiding places. The most vulnerable populations, immigrants, minorities, the poor, remained at risk. This isn't a problem that gets solved once and stays solved, I told a gathering of international law enforcement officials in 1892. It requires constant vigilance, constant adaptation, constant commitment to putting human dignity above all other considerations. The room was full of police chiefs, federal agents, and government officials from dozens of countries. 10 years earlier, the idea of international cooperation on human trafficking would have been unthinkable. Now it was becoming standard practice. Progress was real, but it was also fragile. Each generation would have to choose anew whether to protect the vulnerable or exploit them. The work took its toll over the years. I'd seen too much suffering, witnessed too much cruelty, absorbed too much of the world's darkness. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, haunted by the faces of women I hadn't been able to save in time. Days when the enormity of the problem seemed overwhelming, when every victory felt small against the vast tide of human exploitation. I'd never married, never had children of my own. My personal life had been consumed by professional obligations and the emotional demands of the work. Do you ever wonder what might have been? June asked me during one of my visits to Laramie in 1893. She now had 4 children and a comfortable life as the wife of a respected federal investigator. Sometimes, I admitted, but I can't imagine having made different choices. This work chose me as much as I chose it. You've saved hundreds of lives, Elsie, maybe thousands, when you count all the ripple effects. And lost some too. That's what haunts me. June took my hand and squeezed it gently. You can't save everyone, but you've saved enough to make the world a better place. It was true, but it didn't make the losses any easier to bear. In 1894, 12 years after that fateful day in Laramie, I received an honor that surprised even me. The International Association of Chiefs of Police named me their Woman of the Year, recognizing my contributions to law enforcement and victim advocacy. The ceremony was held in Chicago, attended by law enforcement officials from around the world. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, I thought about all the people who had made this moment possible. Thomas Gray, whose courage and determination had started it all. June, who had survived years of horror and emerged stronger. Marshall Garrett, who had believed in justice when it would have been easier to look the other way. The countless agents, advocates, and allies who had joined the fight. This award doesn't belong to me alone, I told the assembled crowd. It belongs to everyone who has chosen to stand up for the vulnerable, to speak for the voiceless, to fight for justice even when the odds seemed impossible. The applause was thunderous, but I wasn't thinking about the recognition. I was thinking about a dying cowboy in the dust and a frightened saloon maid who had made the choice to help. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion have the largest consequences. As the century drew to a close, I began preparing for retirement. At 51, I was ready to step back from active leadership and allow younger agents to take over the fight. The Federal Anti-Trafficking Bureau was now a permanent part of the Department of Justice, with offices in every state and territory. The work would continue without me, guided by the principles and methods we developed over nearly 2 decades. I chose my successor carefully, Agent Sarah Martinez, one of the first women I trained, who had demonstrated exceptional skill in both investigation and victim advocacy. The work is changing, I told her during the transition briefing. New technologies, new forms of exploitation, new challenges we haven't even imagined yet. But the fundamental mission remains the same. Protect the vulnerable, pursue justice. Never give up hope. Sarah nodded seriously. What's the most important lesson you've learned? I thought about that question for a long time. After nearly 20 years of fighting human trafficking, what had I really learned? That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose compassion over indifference, I said finally. Every case we've solved, every victim we've rescued, every criminal we've prosecuted, it all started with someone caring enough to act. In 1895, I returned to Laramie permanently, buying a small house on the outskirts of town where I could tend a garden and watch the sunrise over the mountains I'd known since childhood. The town had changed dramatically since 1882, where once there had been rough saloons and lawless streets. Now there were schools, churches, businesses run by honest people who cared about their community. The Red Lantern Saloon had been torn down years earlier, replaced by a library that served the entire county. But a small plaque near the entrance marked the spot where the Laramie Rescue had begun, the moment when one person's choice to help. A stranger had started a movement for justice. I often walked past that plaque, remembering the young woman I'd been, the choices I'd made, the life that had unfolded from a single act of mercy. Thomas and June still lived in town, their family, now grown to include 5 children who had never known a world where human trafficking went unpunished. Thomas continued his work as a federal investigator, specializing in corruption cases that might enable trafficking. "Are you happy?" June asked me one evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "I'm at peace," I replied. "There's a difference. Happiness was a temporary emotion, dependent on circumstances. Peace was deeper. The knowledge that you'd lived according to your values, that you'd used your life to make the world a little better. I had that peace. One last challenge awaited me in retirement. In the spring of 1896, I received word that one of Morrison's former associates, a man named Jake Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, had been elected to office in a small Montana town and was reportedly resuming the family business. The news stirred up all the old anger and determination I'd felt 14 years earlier. The Morrison family was still at it, still using positions of authority to exploit the vulnerable. Against the advice of friends and family, I decided to travel to Montana and confront this new Morrison myself. "Elsie, you're 57 years old," June protested. "This isn't your responsibility anymore. You've done enough." "It's everyone's responsibility," I replied. "If we let evil resurrect itself when we're not looking, then everything we've accomplished means nothing." The town of Cedar Falls, Montana, was a rough mining community not unlike Laramie had been in the early days. It was the kind of place where a corrupt sheriff could operate with impunity as long as he maintained order and didn't interfere with business interests. I arrived posing as a traveling journalist writing about law enforcement in mining towns. It was a thin cover, but It gave me an excuse to ask questions and observe Jake Morrison's operations. What I found was disturbingly familiar. Young women disappearing without investigation, suspicious deaths ruled as accidents, a pattern of corruption and violence that mirrored his uncle's crimes. But this time, I wasn't alone. Word of my presence had spread through the network of agents and advocates we'd built over the years. Within a week, I was joined by federal investigators who had come to help. The confrontation came when Morrison realized who I was and what I was doing. "Elsie Fletcher," he said, cornering me outside the hotel where I was staying. "I should have known. My uncle always said you were nothing but trouble." "Your uncle was a murderer and a slave trader," I replied calmly. "I hope you're smarter than he was." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "You destroyed my family. Cost us everything. Your family destroyed itself. I just made sure people knew about it." The federal agents moved in as Morrison made his threats, armed with warrants and evidence gathered during weeks of careful investigation. "Jake Morrison," Agent Williams announced, displaying his federal badge, "you're under arrest for civil rights violations, conspiracy, and corruption." Morrison looked around desperately, probably expecting his deputies to come to his aid. But the federal agents had planned carefully, timing their move when Morrison's men were occupied elsewhere. "This is illegal," Morrison protested as they put handcuffs on him. "You don't have jurisdiction here." "We do when civil rights are involved," Agent Williams replied. "And we have plenty of evidence that you've been violating the civil rights of women in this community." The evidence included testimony from victims, financial records showing suspicious transactions, and correspondence linking Morrison to known trafficking networks. It was more than enough to secure convictions. As they led Morrison away, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Morrison family's criminal enterprise was finally, truly finished. The investigation that followed revealed connections to trafficking, operations in 3 states, leading to dozens of arrests and the rescue of more than 30 victims. It was a fitting end to my career in law enforcement, proving that the work we'd begun in Laramie had created lasting change, that the systems we'd built could function even when the original architects stepped aside. In 1897, 15 years after the day that changed everything, I received a letter that moved me more than any award or recognition ever had. It was from a young woman named Grace Thompson, who was working with trafficking victims in San Francisco. "Dear Miss Fletcher," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that your example saved my life, even though we've never met. I was working as a domestic servant when I discovered my employers were holding several young immigrant women as slaves. I knew I should report what I was seeing, but I was afraid. They were powerful people with connections to city officials. Then I read about your work, about how you started as a saloon maid with no special training or resources, but you acted anyway because it was the right thing to do. That inspired me to contact the federal authorities. The investigation that followed led to the rescue of 12 women and the prosecution of 6 people involved in the trafficking ring. But that's not the end of the story. One of the rescued women has become like a sister to me. Together, we've started our own organization to help immigrant women avoid trafficking situations. None of this would have happened if you hadn't shown us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose compassion over convenience." I read Grace's letter several times, tears of pride and gratitude streaming down my face. This was what it had all been about, not the personal recognition, but knowing that the work would continue, that others were being inspired to fight for justice. The movement we'd started had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined or controlled. As the 19th century came to an end, I often thought about the choices that had brought me to this point in my life. The choice to help a dying stranger. The choice to risk my safety for my sister. The choice to dedicate my life to fighting injustice rather than pursuing personal comfort. Each decision had led to the next, creating a chain of consequences that had affected hundreds of lives and changed the course of American law enforcement. But I also thought about the choices other people had made. Thomas Gray's choice to gather evidence rather than flee to safety. June's choice to survive and help other survivors. Marshall Garrett's choice to take our concerns seriously. The choice of countless agents, advocates, and ordinary citizens to join the fight for justice. Change had never been the work of one person. It had always been the result of many people making similar choices, often independently, often without knowing how their individual actions connected to a larger movement. On New Year's Eve 1899, as the century turned, I stood on my porch looking out at the lights of Laramie and thinking about the future. Somewhere out there, in towns and cities across America and around the world, there were people facing the same choice I'd faced 17 years earlier: to help or to look away, to speak up or stay silent, to act with courage or succumb to fear. The future would be shaped by how those people chose, just as the past had been shaped by the choices of those who came before. I had faith that more would choose courage than cowardice, compassion than indifference, justice than convenience. That faith had been earned through years of seeing ordinary people do extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough and the cause was clear enough. I lived for 11 more years after retiring, dying peacefully in my sleep on a spring morning in 1906, 24 years after the day that had defined my life. June found me the next morning when she came for our weekly visit. I was in my favorite chair by the window, looking out at the mountains I had loved since childhood, with a book of poetry in my lap and a smile on my face. The funeral was held at the community center that had been built where the Red Lantern Saloon once stood. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, not just from Laramie, but from across the country. Former victims whose lives I'd helped save, federal agents who had trained under my guidance, officials who had been inspired by our work to take trafficking seriously, ordinary citizens who had been moved to act by the example we'd set. June gave the eulogy, speaking about the sister she had known and loved. Elsie never thought of herself as a hero, June told the assembled mourners. She was just a woman who couldn't walk past suffering without stopping to help. But that quality, that inability to ignore the pain of others, changed hundreds of lives and created a movement that continues to this day. She often said that the most important thing about her story wasn't what she accomplished, but what it proved about the potential that exists in every human being. We all have the capacity for moral courage. We all have the power to make a difference. We just have to choose to use it. The Federal Anti-Trafficking Bureau continued to grow after my death, eventually becoming a model for law enforcement agencies worldwide. The techniques we developed, the approaches we pioneered, became standard practice in the fight against human exploitation. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the simple principle that had guided my actions from the beginning. When you encounter suffering, you respond with compassion, regardless of the personal cost. Thomas Gray, who had lived until 1904, often told people that the most remarkable thing about our story wasn't the dramatic rescues or the high-profile trials, but the moment when a saloon maid knelt beside a dying stranger and chose to help. Everything else grew from that seed, he would say. One person's decision to see the humanity in someone who was being treated as less than human. 20 years after Thomas's death, and 38 years after that morning in front of the Red Lantern Saloon, June would tell that same story to her grandchildren, making sure they understood that heroism wasn't about having special powers or being chosen for greatness. It's about making the choice to help when help is needed, she would tell them. Even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when no one else will. Sometimes, it takes one broken heart to save another, and one saloon made to remind a town and a nation what mercy looks like. Should Elsie's story be known everywhere? Hit like, comment, Mercy Matters, and subscribe to support stories that deserve to be told.